Right, so basically, I started this to just show people who want to get started with four-player chess what to do at the very start. Because there's literally nowhere on YouTube, at least I can find, where it actually shows beginners how to start playing the game, and it's really tricky to get into at first because you're gonna get checkmated really easily, quite a lot. Because obviously the board's so big, people aren't used to it. But once you get past that first initial stage, it's actually really fun. So I thought it needs to exist because it's really difficult to get started. So I'm just gonna look at the intro. This is all the stuff I plan to cover. In this video, I should get through openings and opening game theory, so you can get through the first few moves of the game, set yourself up nicely to go into the middle game. Well, obviously we'll look at everything in the future. So yeah. So here's the key things that you want to keep in mind when you're playing four-player chess. Obviously this is just the board. We'll look at each color and evaluate like what each color has done. See if it's a good opening or not. So the key things you gotta keep in mind is you gotta be solid, so you can't be vulnerable. You gotta keep your king safe, obviously. Try and keep pieces on the board. You've got to be active, so these pieces have got to be looking at things like this. Light square bishops open, whereas like none of green's pieces are really doing anything. All the blue's pieces are all out pointing at stuff. And then don't blindly push for a queen because first of all you've got no development. Everything's on the starting square and you're now a target because you got the most material. Right, so we'll start off by saying red's good after the first few moves here because he's got nice open lines for his queen, directed at green's king. Nice open lines this way. His bishop's nice and open. He's clearly got a plan. He's gonna come plant his king here, and have his think out his bishop and have a nice solid game with active pieces. Blue, same thing. Even though people might think, oh, this pawn's pushed, he's completely safe on his king side here. Um, Potentially the king can come here. Potentially he can stay in the middle. Um, Obviously this pawn's here to block this diagonal onto his king, because out of all of the squares in your starting position, this pawn here is always the weakest because it's only defended by your king. So he's got active bishop, he's got active knight, he's got active queen. His queen can come out staring at things easily. He's nice and safe and quite compact. And then yellow's bad. We'll say that yellow's bad, even though he's literally up a queen on everyone else. Obviously, it's nice to be up a queen, but you can't sacrifice all development because even being up a queen, the other three players in the game have more queens than you and obviously more turns. So if you make yourself a target by being up material, then you're going to be attacked and you've got absolutely no development to make that happen. So it's not really good to just blindly push for a queen, even though it's very common among new players who just don't have a game plan. Even all the way up to about 2000, a lot of people just blindly push for queens. And I understand the thinking, but it's just not very good. I think green's bad because obviously um, he's got his king safe, which is obviously a positive, but he's just no activity. All his pawns he's trapped in, his bishop's trapped, his queen's trapped. Is not if his lines were open towards yellow, he could really take advantage of the fact that um, yellow's so inactive. Like for example, if he'd have pushed this pawn and moved his queen here, he could take advantage of this long diagonal, potentially getting a checkmate off on yellow really early on because yellow's just blindly pushing. If you start the game like this, it's not to say that you're gonna lose because obviously nature of four-player chess, you can be behind, come ahead very easily. but it's never in your best interest to be so inactive in the game, because especially once you get to the higher sort of levels, you kind of need the activity because of how the game works. You need to be able to, even if you're not being attacked, you need to dictate the way the game's actually going to for it to be in your favour. And being very inactive in the start and having no lines open, no active pieces, is not a very good way to start the game off. Right, so this is stuff that you don't really want to do. So you don't want to open lines to your king. Obviously, don't do that first move. A lot of people like to push this pawn because it's defended by your queen. Definitely not a very good idea. Try to start with either this pawn or this pawn, or move this pawn 2 squares. Like, really, no matter which colour you are, if you're green, only this pawn or this pawn 2 squares, because then you leave yourself up for checkmate very quickly if you don't do that. It's kind of like there's not that many good opening moves just because of like the way the board's kind of set up in the modern variation, but it is more fair. And obviously, like, if one person, one color decides to do anything different, the game spirals out of control very fast. So now we've seen what we want the opening sort of stuff to look like, let's look at how we get there. So for red, these good opening moves, obviously. That this was the first move. Obviously, it's targeting. It's just moving, letting the queen get out. Just that's the only idea behind this, and then potentially preparing to move this pawn forwards twice without the king being exposed to the blue queen. And obviously, like I've already said, the weakest square in everyone's position is the king's bishop pawn. That's because it's only defended by the king again. So blue's idea behind playing this pawn, red's idea behind playing this pawn forward is to open up the line towards blue's weakest square. And then the second move opens up this bishop for activity. Obviously, it's staring at the other green bishop. Now you can potentially, definitely at low level, you'll see a lot of people capture that, and then the queen should recapture and open back up to green's king just here, and then yellow can open up to push this pawn forward and open up, and it'll be very dangerous for green, and they're looking at getting checkmated rather quickly. Obviously, with the second pawn forward, this blocks this long diagonal where if blue's queen somehow made it onto this diagonal, potentially pushing this pawn, aiming here, just natural, and then the queen comes here onto this diagonal. Obviously, that's needs to be stopped. It's just stopped it preemptively. So look at now. I said the idea behind blue's pushing this pawn is to literally just block this diagonal, so red's queen is no longer staring at blue's weakest pawn. So that's the idea. It keeps blue in like a reactive state where they're reacting and they can sort of pick their opening based on what other people are doing. Potentially, if the person to your right has played this opening, and the person to your left hasn't, potentially you might want to look at pushing the queen's bishop pawn and the queen's pawn, because if the person to your right has played it and the person to your left hasn't, it's sometimes quite beneficial to play. You get a lot of play and it kind of stops red's play a lot. But in this scenario, I've pushed the king's pawn just to open up the bishop and the queen at looking at capturing this pawn if he ever needs to check red to gain tempo for whatever reason at the cost of a queen. Maybe yellow's getting checkmated, maybe green's getting checkmated, sorry, and he doesn't want that to happen. He can just check red for whatever reason. He might not need to. That. And then yellow's first, just simple king's pawn, just simple opening queen up, opening the bishop up. Second, closing off this diagonal. Obviously, green's opened up towards the king, whilst opening up his own sort of threat towards green's king. It's still solid. Obviously, the pawn's still in a nice connected structure. Obviously, in this kind of structure, with the pawns being on light squares, the dark square bishop becomes quite valuable. Try not to trade that off if you can. Obviously, the light squared bishop becomes not so valuable, and potentially can trade off early, but still try and keep peace on the board just in general. And then, so this is actually a good response to red opening up this bishop, is to play this pawn, which is obviously protected by this bishop. Obviously, at the same time, opens up this diagonal towards red's weakest square. Just means you can place the knight there if red decides to open this up by playing the pawn here. Obviously targeting this square, you can place the knight here to block that still. It's just generally quite good to do. It's obviously the other sort of like you don't want to allow red to capture your bishop, so the other move would be to capture red's bishop and then be sort of wary that you might be a bit vulnerable. Obviously at some point you're going to have to deal with this queen staring at your most weak pawn. So yeah, that's just a bit of opening, just a bit of advice to get you started off the mark. Sort of few moves in, just to maybe just pick one of these sort of setups out of red, blue, yellow, green to just play every time, depending on what kind of play you like to be. Do you like early trades? Obviously, I mentioned that all of red's pawns are going to be on light squares, so this white bishop's not necessarily a good bishop to be taken, especially because it opens this diagonal towards your king. But it's okay, you won't be made or anything, and it's definitely something you can do, get early points on the board. So let's look at what this sort of opening would lead to potentially. So a few moves down the line, obviously you can see like the result of this kind of opening for all sides. So obviously green's red started early confrontation with green, obviously by playing opening up the bishops to see each other. Now green's reintroduced that tension sort of by opening towards red's bishop. Obviously for red, this is a bishop you want to keep on the board, and for green, this is a bishop you don't really want to keep on the board, so potentially better for green, not so good for red, this sort of the way this is going to happen, because obviously red's not quite as active, the queen's not centralized, the bishop's kind of blocked. This bishop's a really good bishop that you want to keep in defense of your king, and it's going to be attacked by green, and you have to respond to it, because if not, it's attacking your rook and your knight, and might just come back. So long term, everyone's king's relatively safe. Red obviously has to keep his king side solid and try and avoid trades with green if possible, because of the bishops, and obviously the more pieces you trade, the less pieces you have to defend yourself. Blue has to try and keep activity, because obviously he needs to target as many squares as possible, because green and red have tension, so potentially he might be looking at getting any tempo on red if green takes something of red's, or red takes something of green's, possibly, maybe not. Look at attacking something else, creating two threats, and then making red deal with one. Obviously bearing in mind that yellow might come after him, because the other two people are in tension. Yellow, same thing, has to keep active, try and stop blue's game plan, potentially stop blue trying to take advantage of red, potentially take advantage of green themselves. They have multiple things that they can attack of greens. Obviously this pawn could come 2 squares forward and threaten the queen. This knight can come here to threaten the queen. There's multiple things I can do, especially to exploit the sort of tension that green and red are going to have in this game. And green just has to stay solid, do not overcommit, because an overcommit, if you do this, obviously, if yellow now attacks your queen, now that you've opened up this tension, you're going to have to react to that, and you're not going to potentially be able to fight against red. You have to, every move you make, you have to bear in mind that 3 other people are going to be moving in reaction to your move. So yeah, it's just like a few things to keep in mind for the game plan of each of the colours. What to keep in mind when you go into tension early on. Try and potentially keep pieces on the board. And every single colour in this position has a chance to win the game, just because the nature of free-for-all chess is just, even if you are ahead, the 3 other players can sort of bring you back down to the average or possibly even below, especially if you're too far ahead. If you've got a queen early on, people might just see that and think, oh, I'm going to go for you. So yeah, I think that's a good start towards openings. Obviously, just try a few out, but the best advice is to just play yourself, to be honest. Playing the game is, there's not really a substitute. You can't really learn better in a better way than playing the game, but obviously it sucks to just be checkmated in the first 2 minutes of trying the game, or the first minute, and you feel like you don't know what you're doing, you feel out of depth, and there's nothing worse than that. And obviously you should just keep going, stick at it, because after you get to the point where you're sort of getting an understanding of the game, it does get really fun.